Everyone following this conflict is asking the wrong question: whether Russia is winning or losing, whether the front lines will hold or collapse, whether Zelensky survives this politically. Those are real questions, but they are questions about the surface of the thing. What the architecture of this emerging peace framework reveals, when you examine it structurally rather than tactically, is something more precise and considerably more alarming. What I see is a trap, not a compromise, not even a bad deal, a trap, a deliberately, historically tested, systematically constructed trap. And the sobering part, the part most commentators will not say plainly, is that the trap is not set for Ukraine alone. It is set for NATO, for American credibility, for every security guarantee ever made to every country that is right now watching how this story ends. Here is the claim with no diplomatic softening. Russia has signed formal ceasefire agreements 3 times in 30 years. And each one, every single one, was followed by a larger, more lethal, more destabilizing conflict than the one it paused. That is not analysis. That is the documented historical record. Right now, while delegations meet and governments draft their press releases and markets price instability, Russia is studying that record. And it may be the only party at the table that fully understands what that record means. The deal being assembled is not the end of this war. It is the architectural blueprint for the next one. And by the time most people recognize that, the window to change the outcome will have already closed. Anchor number 18% versus 7%. ISW, February 2025, size of England. The analytical framework that maps this most precisely is what strategic historians call the freeze-exploit cycle. 3 stages: freeze, legitimize, restart. Russia has executed this cycle 3 times since 1994. Each time, the cycle was functionally invisible to Western publics until the restart phase was already in motion. By then, the window to intervene at low cost had closed. By the end of this analysis, you will understand the structure of what is being negotiated right now better than the vast majority of people following this conflict in real time, including most of the commentators covering it daily. Because most analysis is focused on tactics, the maps, the drone counts, the casualty figures. The trap is not in the tactics, it is in the architecture. The single number that reveals the shape of the whole story is this. As of February 2025, according to the Institute for the Study of War, Russia controls approximately 18% of Ukraine's sovereign territory. That is an area roughly the size of England. Before the Minsk ceasefire frameworks of 2014 and 2015, Russia controlled 7%. The entire managed diplomacy period, 8 years of it, coincided exactly with Russia expanding from 7% to 18%. The deal currently on the table would freeze those borders, not reverse them, not contest them, permanently freeze them. Here is why that single decision is the mechanism that makes the next war not a possibility, but a structural near certainty. To understand what this deal is architecturally doing, you have to begin not in 2022, not in 2014, but in December of 1994. The Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine at that moment held the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. Approximately 1,100 strategic warheads inherited from the Soviet Union. More nuclear capability than Britain and France combined. More, in fact, than China. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia signed a formal multilateral security agreement. Ukraine would surrender every one of those weapons. In exchange, all 3 signatories formally committed, in writing, witnessed internationally, to respecting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. 18 years later, Russia annexed Crimea. Consider the full weight of that exchange. Ukraine in 1994 held more nuclear weapons than China. The Budapest Transfer was the largest voluntary nuclear disarmament in modern history. The specific language of the memorandum was not vague reassurance. It used the word reaffirm. It used the word obligations. It was formally registered with the United Nations. None of it carried any mechanism by which the signatories could be compelled to honor it. That absence was not an oversight. Enforcement mechanisms are politically difficult. In 1994, with the Cold War freshly ended and optimism about post-Soviet Russia running at its peak, the political will to include real consequences simply did not exist. Former Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk stated in testimony to the Ukrainian parliament in 2014, this is his documented direct testimony, that Ukraine had been deceived by paper guarantees with no enforcement mechanism. The absence of that mechanism in 1994 created the conditions for Crimea in 2014. The absence of a credible enforcement mechanism in the current framework, and there is none, creates the identical structural vulnerability at a larger scale. That is the first structural feature of how this system operates. The next move is planned before the document is signed, and here is what makes this trap structurally different from every ceasefire that came before it. The connection most analysis has not made yet. The governments driving this deal hardest right now have, according to strategic risk assessments circulating in European policy circles, privately concluded that it will not hold past a decade. They are supporting it anyway. What they are actually purchasing is not peace, and understanding exactly who needs that purchase most, that changes every calculation that follows. Move to 2014 and 2015, Minsk for Minsk the Sioux. Two ceasefire agreements signed after Russian-backed forces seized portions of eastern Ukraine. Both demanded a ceasefire line, withdrawal of heavy weapons, and restoration of Ukrainian control over its own borders. The OSCE was deployed to monitor compliance. Neither core demand was meaningfully implemented. Not one. What happened instead, documented in OSCE Special Monitoring Mission reports from 2015 through 2021, was systematic. During both Minsk ceasefire periods, Russian-backed forces fortified occupied territory, constructed logistics infrastructure, and rotated fresh units into the zone. The supply corridors, the command structures, the forward positioning that drove the 2022 full-scale invasion, much of it was built during the years of peace, not before the peace, during it. In December 2022, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel gave an interview to Die Zeit. The line that drew significant attention was direct. The Minsk agreement was an attempt to give Ukraine time to become stronger. Read that sentence carefully. The ceasefire she co-brokered was not, in her own framing, a genuine settlement. It was a strategic preparation period. She said so only after the full invasion had already happened, after the preparation period had ended, after Russia had demonstrated definitively which side had better used those years. Russia had used them better. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a documented admission from the person who helped design the agreement, made publicly in a major German newspaper after the fact. This pattern has a formal name in strategic analysis, the frozen conflict template. Russia has deployed it not once, but systematically across multiple theaters. South Ossetia, 2008. Russian-backed forces seized the territory in 5 days. A ceasefire was brokered under French mediation. Russian forces have remained positioned there ever since. Georgia's NATO accession pathway, precisely the strategic prize Moscow was protecting, was effectively foreclosed by the frozen conflict sitting on its soil. Not by military defeat, by the frozen conflict simply existing. Transnistria, a Russian-backed separatist enclave in Moldova, maintained by Russian forces since 1992. Moldova's European integration has been structurally complicated by that frozen conflict for over 30 years. Not because the conflict is still active, because it exists, because Russia holds the lever. In each case, the frozen conflict is not a stable outcome. It is a managed lever of permanent instability, one that can be unfrozen whenever the political calculation shifts. Ukraine is being offered this same architecture. Frozen borders, no credible enforcement mechanism, a formal agreement with a built-in restart clause that only one party at the table fully comprehends. Now here is the second mechanism, and this one operates at a level most coverage has missed entirely. Freezing a conflict does not only stop the fighting, it transfers legitimacy. A frozen border inside a signed, internationally recognized agreement is not the same legal or political entity as a contested border, practically, diplomatically, legally. It is functionally a border. Russia would emerge from this deal not as a state that seized territory illegally and failed to hold it. It would emerge as a state that negotiated a settlement. And that distinction between illegal seizure and negotiated outcome has consequences that travel far beyond Ukraine's borders. Here is where this stops being abstract for the 40-plus countries watching from NATO's eastern flank. European natural gas imports from Russia peaked at approximately 45% of total EU gas supply in 2021, according to Eurostat. That dependency was a direct structural constraint on European political will in the years after 2014. Germany, Austria, Hungary, the countries most visibly cautious about sustained pressure on Russia, were precisely the countries most economically linked to Russian energy. Russia's strategic planners understood that relationship. Energy dependency and political caution were not coincidental. They were connected architecture. And the lesson embedded in the current deal is this: structural economic dependencies can be weaponized as reliably as missiles. They just move more quietly. Because legitimacy, once transferred, is portable. Rehook 2. 830, sheer 145 words. Now I want you to take a deep breath before we go further, because what follows is not a worst-case scenario constructed by pessimists. It is the written, published, formally documented strategic objective of one of the parties currently seated at this negotiating table, and it has been available to read for years. Section 6, peak tension, 830, 14 lines, or 820 words. Pause moment, your words 11 wags. Probability, ECFR, March 2025, Historical parallel, Brest-Litovsk, 1918. The country watching this outcome most carefully is not in Europe. It is watching from across the Taiwan Strait, and its strategic planners are not asking whether Russia won or lost. They are asking one specific question. Did the freeze-exploit cycle, executed at scale against a democratic state with active Western security commitments, produce durable strategic gains for the aggressor? Or did Western resolve hold long enough to reverse them? As of this moment, from Beijing's documented strategic perspective, the experiment is returning instructive results. Western military aid to Ukraine peaked in 2023, according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, and declined in volume through 2024. Public support for continued military assistance dropped measurably across multiple NATO member states, as recorded in Eurobarometer surveys through late 2024. Washington entered a period of explicit strategic recalibration in early 2025. The political will that defined the initial Western response has measurably shortened, in ways that are now publicly quantifiable. The lesson Beijing is drawing is not that Russia was too aggressive. The lesson is that the West's strategic resolve has a shelf life, and that shelf life can be calculated in months. Taiwan's official defense doctrine, as articulated in its 2023 National Defense Report, operates on the assumption that any conflict with the People's Republic would require rapid Western military intervention to be survivable in the medium term. That assumption rests on two legs: Taiwan's own military capability and the credible expectation that Western security commitments mean what they say. If the Ukraine outcome demonstrates that those commitments have a practical time horizon before political exhaustion overrides strategic logic, Taiwan's deterrence calculus is structurally altered, not by Taiwan's choices, by the precedent being set right now in Eastern Europe. The freeze-exploit cycle, if validated here, becomes a tested, proven template, and tested templates get used again. Before going further, something deserves a full stop. As of March 2025, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs documented over 12,000 confirmed civilian deaths in Ukraine since February 2022. Independent assessments from the Conflict Observatory at Yale University place combined losses, military and civilian, significantly higher, with multiple documented estimates exceeding 100,000 people. Over 6 million Ukrainians are registered as refugees in European countries. Over 5 million more are internally displaced within Ukraine itself. These are real people, not strategic variables, not entries in a geopolitical ledger, families, parents, children, professions that no longer exist, futures that were canceled. Every analysis of future deterrence and war prevention sits behind and because of those specific human lives. The moral weight of getting this architecture right is not abstract. It has names attached to it. Now back to the documented structure of what is being offered. Russia's formal negotiating position, submitted in writing as a treaty draft simultaneously to NATO and the United States in December 2021, demanded that NATO permanently withdraw military infrastructure from all countries that joined after 1997: Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, all of them. Analysts at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace assessed in early 2022 that these demands represented Russia's actual minimum acceptable outcome, presented as a formal treaty requirement, not an opening bid to be negotiated downward. A frozen conflict in Ukraine does not deliver that demand directly, but it demonstrates something more strategically valuable: that the demand is achievable incrementally, one frozen conflict at a time, one exhausted Western democracy at a time. One administration change at a time. The European Council on Foreign Relations, in their March 2025 scenario planning assessment, placed the probability of renewed Russian military action against Ukraine or another neighboring state within 10 to 15 years of a frozen conflict settlement at between 55 and 70%. That is a mainstream European strategic institution, not a fringe estimate, and that figure has received considerably less coverage than its implications warrant. The historical parallel that frames this most clearly is not Minsk. It is Brest-Litovsk, March 1918. Revolutionary Russia, facing military collapse after 3 years of catastrophic war, signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers. Russia surrendered Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and significant portions of the Caucasus. Devastating territorial losses described publicly as a national humiliation. Lenin signed it not because Russia accepted those borders permanently, but because Russia needed a strategic interval. Within 20 months, as the Central Powers collapsed in the West, Russia had reversed nearly every one of those losses. The humiliating peace had been a staging ground, not a settlement. Putin's Russia is not Lenin's Russia. The parallel is not a direct transfer. But the structural logic, sign what is necessary, use the interval for repositioning, resume from a stronger position, is documented Russian operational behavior demonstrated across 3 ceasefire cycles since 1994. That is not a hypothesis about Russian character or intentions. It is an observable, repeating pattern, and patterns in strategy are predictions. The counter-argument deserves a full, honest hearing because it is not unreasonable. It goes like this. An imperfect peace that stops the killing is morally preferable to a perfect strategic position that continues it. That the deaths any ceasefire prevents, however imperfect the terms, belong to real people. And no geopolitical framework is worth a human life. That demanding Ukraine keep fighting until full territorial recovery, while being advocated largely by people who are not themselves fighting, places strategic principle above human reality in ways that are ethically uncomfortable. That Ukrainians themselves have the right to determine what terms they can accept and what costs they are willing to bear. That argument has genuine moral weight. It deserves to be stated honestly before being challenged. The challenge is not that peace is wrong. The challenge is about what kind of peace is actually on the table. A ceasefire with no enforcement mechanism is not peace in any durable sense. It is a formalized pause. The critical structural distinction between a genuine peace settlement and a managed ceasefire is the presence of a credible enforcement architecture. Guarantees that carry automatic, costly consequences for violation rather than merely diplomatic disappointment. The Minsk frameworks had no such structure. The current framework, as assessed by analysts at the Wilson Center in their February 2025 evaluation of emerging terms, similarly contains no Ukrainian NATO membership pathway, no binding military guarantee from any Western power, and no enforcement mechanism beyond the stated preferences of governments that have already demonstrated, historically and recently, a limited tolerance for sustained strategic commitment. What would a genuine deterrence-based peace actually require? Security guarantees with automatic military consequences for violation, a Ukrainian military capacity maintained at a level that makes resumed aggression costly rather than strategically attractive, a formal multilateral statement that territorial changes achieved by force will not be recognized in any international framework going forward, and a sustained Western investment in Ukrainian reconstruction substantial enough to create genuine material incentives for a stable border. None of those elements are present in the framework currently being described by serious analysts with access to the emerging terms. What is present is a ceasefire that Russia can exit at a time of its own choosing, a legitimacy transfer that strengthens its position for the next negotiation, and a Western political environment that will, predictably and demonstrably, use the pause to reduce defense commitments, rotate attention to other crises, and reclassify this as a resolved matter before it actually is. The people who will pay the price for that reclassification are not the governments making the decision. There is one final variable worth tracking directly. A frozen conflict in Ukraine changes the security calculus for every country along Russia's western border. Moldova, with Transnistria already frozen. Georgia, with South Ossetia already frozen. The Baltic states, watching the precedent being set right now for what a NATO commitment is actually worth when democratic fatigue sets in. Finland, which joined NATO in 2023 specifically because it concluded that neutrality agreements with Russia carry no enforcement weight. Each of those countries is recalculating right now. Watch what they do with their defense budgets in the 12 months following any announced settlement. Watch whether the United States maintains or quietly reduces its forward-positioned forces in Poland and the Baltics. Watch whether Ukraine receives any meaningful binding security guarantee or receives language that sounds like one but contains none of the enforcement structure that would make it real. Those 3 signals will tell you which direction this resolves before any headline announces it. What I want you to take from this is not fear. Fear is not useful. What is useful is the map. Because when you can see the pattern, when you can name the freeze-exploit cycle and identify the structural moment in which it is operating, you can see what is likely coming before it arrives. That is not pessimism. That is preparation. Wars almost never start because everyone decided they wanted one. They start because someone looked at the previous ceasefire, found no enforcement mechanism, assessed that the other side's political will had shortened past its critical threshold, and concluded that the conditions for the next move had arrived. The peace being offered right now is not the end of this story. It is the condition that makes the next chapter structurally possible. Someone has to say that plainly. Now you know.